Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bastion Entertainment. Today we're going to be using GameMaker Studio to test out some top-down 4-directional sprite animation with emphasis on some code that'll handle our direction speed. No matter if we're diagonal, up, down, left, or right, it'll set it at the same speed. So let's jump in. First thing we're going to do is open up GameMaker and click blank game. After that, we'll name our project 4-directional SPR for Sprite. First thing you're going to do is create a new sprite, and we're going to open up the image editor or the built-in sprite editor. I've created a little stamp ahead of time, and this is going to be our idle sprite animation. Go ahead and duplicate your frames. We're just going to use 4 frames, keep it simple. We'll give him just a little bit more movement. Oh, don't forget to set your FPS or frames per second to 4. We're going to create an object, and we're just going to call this object obj underscore SPR underscore player. So we're going to open up our object sprite player, and we're going to add the sprite that we just created. Now we're going to add a create event, and GameMaker is going to ask us by default if we want to use GML or the D&D drag and drop system. So go ahead and click GML for this project. And once you have your create event open, we'll get to coding. Alright, I'm just going to drop some pasted code in here. I've already typed it out a few times working on this video, and so it's all prepared and we know it's all going to work ahead of time. Now let's talk about exactly what's going on here. Exactly what does this code do? Direction equals 1. This line sets the direction variable to 1. In GameMaker, the direction variable represents the angle at which the instance is facing. In this case, setting it to 1 might imply a specific direction or orientation for your player character. Sprite index equals SPR player idle. This line sets the sprite index variable to the idle sprite. In GameMaker, the sprite index determines the sprite that is currently assigned to the instance. We'll get more into that later. Here it suggests that the player character is using the sprite named SPR player idle. The speed is set to 1. We're going to change that to 2 here in a second. This line sets the speed variable to 1. In GameMaker, the speed variable determines the speed at which an instance moves. Next, we're going to add a step event. Make sure you're still on your object sprite player. Create the step event. And this is just going to be some input handling for our player character. So that's a big chunk of code. Let's talk about what it does and how it functions. This calculates the horizontal movement dx based on the right and left arrow key inputs. If the right arrow key is pressed, it adds 1. If the left arrow key is pressed, it subtracts 1. Similarly, this calculates the vertical movement dy based on the down and up arrow keys. The if statement checks if either dx or dy is not equal to 0. If there's any movement input, it proceeds to normalize the direction vector. This calculates the length magnitude of the vector. And this divides both dx and dy by their length to normalize the vector, ensuring that the player moves at a consistent speed regardless of the direction. Finally, this sets the horizontal and vertical speeds based on the normalized direction vectors. Okay, so once we've got that all typed out in our step event, you're going to go to Rooms in your asset browser, and we're going to go to Room 1. Make sure that you're on the Instances layer. grab your object sprite player and drag it into the room. Real quick before we run the game, we want to adjust the player speed to 2. This is a good starting point. If you want him to go faster or slower, you can adjust this yourself. And now you can run your game, and you'll see that your idle sprite is moving around when you press the keys. Now let's add some sprite animation for each direction. Create a new sprite and go ahead and title this sprite SPR_player_up. Once again, we're going to go into our sprite editor and we're going to duplicate this into 4 frames. And since he's walking up, we want these feet to be facing kind of upward and outward. And we want his arms to kind of swing as he walks up. On your 4th frame, you're just going to create a mirrored image of the 2nd frame. Adjust our FPS, put it down to 4. And just like we did in the idle animation, we'll get his head to bob up and down a little bit. Just brings the character to life a little more. Okay, the next sprite we're going to work on is the walking down sprite. And since he's walking down, we want his feet to kind of turn in behind him to create the illusion that he's walking towards the camera. And once again, we're going to create a mirrored sprite for frames 2 and 4. They should be opposite of each other. Four frames per second. Don't forget to make his head bob a little bit. Lastly, we're going to create our sprite that is walking either left or right, and I'm just going to call this SPR player side, because as you can see, our sprite is pretty asymmetrical, so we won't need to do a flip function or anything like that. By keeping our character design simple, it'll just look the same whether he's walking left or right. This one's definitely a little trickier. His arms are mostly going to be by his sides, so we don't see them much. We just want to make just a few frames where it looks like he's swinging his arms side to side as he walks. Okay, this next bit of code is going to control which sprite the game is using based on your inputs, up, down, left, and right. And this way, it'll switch between sprite animations. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly this code is doing. This line checks if the left arrow key is pressed. If true, it sets the sprite index to SPR player side when moving left. If the left arrow key is not pressed, it checks if the right arrow key is being pressed. If true, it will also set the sprite index to SPR player side when moving right. If neither left nor right arrow keys are pressed, it checks if the up or down arrow keys are pressed. If true, it sets the sprite index to SPR player up. This implies that the player character should face upward when moving. If none of the previous conditions are met, it checks if the down arrow key is pressed. If true, it sets the sprite index to SPR player down. If none of the arrow keys are pressed, it sets the sprite index to SPR player idle. This is the default sprite when the player character is not actively moving. Alright, once you've got that all filled out in your step event, go ahead and run your game. And you should have a sprite that walks in all 4 directions with 4 different animations. And when you're not holding any keys, he should return to his idle state. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please tune in next time for more game dev ideas and tips. Until then, happy coding and happy game making.